Hi there. We'll get started in about 5 minutes, but I just wanted to know if folks can hear me before we get started. If you can, just respond to me in the chat box and let me know that you can hear me. Great. Thank you very much. Okay, great. Like I said, we'll get started in about 5 minutes. Thank you. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Statistics Solutions Chapter 1 webinar. A couple things before we get started. We have Brittany with us. She is a co-host and a support person, and you can see that in the chat box she's posting links to our website, also links to our webinar archive library where this and other webinars can be found. You'll also have a copy of the webinar sent to you. Also, if you have any kind of technical issues as we go along, you can reach out to Brittany. She could try to help you. As far as questions on the content as we go along, feel free to type your questions into the question and answer box or the chat box so you don't forget them. But I won't get to them until the end. I'm not going to stop and take them, in the middle of the presentation, but I will get to any messages you post at the end, and we will have a question and answer session at the end where I'll try to answer your questions. Okay, so let's get started. All right, so chapter 1, this is the introduction to the dissertation. And the first thing I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to tell you several times throughout this presentation, is always get the template or chapter guidelines from your school. This will serve as a good kind of, general template, a general guide for the chapter 1, because a lot of the features are similar throughout schools, but sometimes schools do have things that are particular. Maybe the order of the headers will be different, or sometimes the titles of the headers will be a little different. So again, this is going to be a good general guide, but you always want to stick with your school's template because sometimes there are minor differences. And that is sometimes usually the first reason for your chair or your committee to kind of turn your draft back to you, if it's not adhering to the school's template. Sometimes they'll just say, make sure it follows the template and just turn it right back around to you. So always get that, follow it. Okay, so moving forward, the chapter 1, the introduction. This is what we're going to cover. The sections, and again, they're fairly standard. Big picture, what is the chapter 1? What is the purpose of the chapter 1? What does it do? Basically, it's a blueprint for your study, right? If we're going to follow the 5-chapter model, which is, again, is pretty typical. Chapter 1 is the introduction. Chapter 2 is literature review. Chapter 3 is where you discuss your methodology. And usually those first 3 chapters they constitute the proposal, right? This is you're building a case for your study. You're proposing what you're going to do. After that's approved, you collect data. And then in comes your chapter 4, which is where you present your results. And then chapter 5, where you discuss your results. Now, some schools have more than 5 chapters. Sometimes schools outside of the United States will have 6 chapters, dissertations, but usually the chapters are split up in such a way, but the content is usually the same. So the chapter 1 is the blueprint for your study. It's going to tell your reader your topic, what you're studying, the rationale, why you're studying it. That's the research problem. And methods, how are you going to study it? And again, there's a methods chapter 3, where you go into more depth in the methods, but there is some discussion, some forecasting of the methods in chapter 1. Okay, so the introduction to the introduction. This basically, introduces your topic, introduces what you're going to study, says a little bit about why you're going to study it, and how that's going to address the research problem, which we'll get to in a minute. And so this is an introduction. You're not going to get into a lot of detail because that's going to come later in the chapter. But usually it involves introducing the social or organizational problem that your study is designed to address. All studies, unless they're kind of applied research or they're just something a little different, most dissertation studies start with some kind of social problem or organizational problem, right? So this could be attrition in a certain sector, or maybe, the attrition of special education teachers. It could be, failing test scores or failing grades in a certain area and a certain population of students. So there's going to be a social problem. There's going to be an organizational problem that your study is designed to address. So you want to put that out there, introduce the problem, use statistics or a supported observation from a peer-reviewed source to kind of anchor that, to show that there is a problem. And of course, you want to use recent sources here or recent statistics, right? If you're talking about some kind of labor shortage or attrition, like I said, of special education teachers, don't give a statistic from 10 years ago to anchor that. Give as recent a statistic as you can. And then you want to introduce the research problem, right? And again, you're going to talk more about this later in a later section. But so you have the organizational, the social problem, but then there's also going to be, the research problem, which is what research are we still lacking? What kind of research do we still need to address this problem? So introduce that, why is your study needed to address this specific issue? And then talk a little bit about how your study is designed to address the research problem. And you can end the section with a preview of the contents of the chapter if you want to do that. But again, follow your specific school's templates if it has anything more specific, but this is usually pretty typical. The introduction section doesn't need to be long. It just needs to be, pretty concise. Also, you don't want to get into too much detail here because you're going to get into detail in the later sections. So, again, just introduce the problem, what you're going to be doing, the research that's needed, like why your study is needed on it. The introduction, I don't know, about, probably a page, it's not too long of a section. And this is what I always tell people about writing the introduction to anything, really. It's counterintuitive not to start with the introduction, right? Because it's the first thing people are going to read. It's the introduction. But let me just throw this at you. If it's hard to introduce something if you don't know what you've written yet. So, and whatever works best for you, but what I advise people to consider is put a placeholder in your introduction. You write something and know that you're going to change it. And then, start with the other sections. And then when you get the rest of the chapter down, you can come back to the introduction. You can see what you've done, and then you can come back and introduce it properly. So, so again, if you can't nail the introduction down at the beginning, that's fine, because again, you don't have the material down to introduce yet, if that makes sense. Okay. And another suggestion, if you can, and you should be able to, from your school, it's always good to get an approved dissertation or two from your school, as close to what you're doing, in your area as possible, to look at as examples. Sometimes your chair will give you one. Sometimes if you ask your chair, they'd be happy to give you one. You can also go into ProQuest, which you should be able to access through your university library. ProQuest publishes people's dissertations. You can search it by school. So because, you can use your resources, which I encourage you to do, go to webinars, use the internet, whatever resources you have available. But sometimes there's no beating, just having an example at hand when you sit down to write, so you can see how other people have approached some of these sections. Okay, the background follows from the introduction. Once you've introduced, what you're going to do and why, then the reader needs to get up to speed, right, on where the issue has been, and not just the issue itself, right? So there needs to be a little bit of historical material here. If attrition has been a problem in special education, well, get the reader up to speed. When did that start? What have been some of the kind of consequences of that? And this is kind of broad strokes, and focus on broad strokes, focus on trends. You don't need to get into a lot of detail, but you do need to use sources, and not only on the issue itself, like attrition of special education teachers, but also this is a background on the research on the topic, right? Because you're going to lead into the next section is the research problem. This section is going to lead into the research problem. So you want to talk about a little bit about what are some of the the major trends in the research on that topic. What have some of the major researchers focused on? What's been tried, what's been studied, what have they found, and that helps you set up later, like what has been done and what still needs to be done. Okay, focus on major trends in the research. What is known about the topic, right? What do we know so far, right? Give us the highlights in the background of what we know so far about the topic and about the research on the topic. And you want to end where the research on your topic stands, right? So where are we now, right? That's how the background should end. And it should end at the gap in the literature, or the need for your study, which leads into the research problem. But this background helps you build that case for what has gone before, and then what still needs to be done. Which leads into the research problem, which is a more targeted discussion of the recent research on your topic, to highlight the research problem, right? So before you're talking, you're looking at historical trends, you're talking about, major trends in the research, what's known. This is a little more targeted. Keep stuff, your material that you quote recent, right? Because it's important that you show your professors and you show your readers that the research problem is current, right? You don't support the research problem with research from 10 years ago, because it may not be a problem anymore. And you want to specifically state the research problem, okay? And specifically state that your study is designed to address the research problem. There are different kinds of research problems. Hold on, let me pause real quick, because page length. Just to go back real quick, the background can be several pages, whatever it takes to kind of lay that foundation. All right. The research problem itself, this section is usually pretty short, maybe a couple paragraphs, a couple solid paragraphs. So types of research problems. I mentioned a gap earlier. A gap in the literature, or a gap in knowledge, is a kind of research problem. It's not the only kind. Okay, people, they go to gaps in knowledge or gaps in literature. They seem to gravitate to those, and I think they're a little more easy to identify, but they're not the only kind of research problem. What is a research problem? Well, it's just like it sounds. It's a problem or an issue in the research. Let's see if we have a question, and I'll get to it at the end. I'll come back to this. A research problem is a problem or an issue in the research. And again, it could be a gap. We don't have the knowledge on this area, right? Maybe because it's a new area of study, or it's just been, somehow ignored, or, maybe it's with a specific population. We have knowledge in the area and the topic on certain populations as it relates to certain populations, but not this one, which is the one you're going to study. Okay, so a gap in the literature is a type of research problem. There's also other kinds of research problems. One problem or issue could be, well, we have a lot of research in this area that is quantitative. We have very little qualitative research. So that can be a kind of research problem, or vice versa. We have a lot of qualitative research. We need, quantitative, or we need a different type of approach, like a case study approach, which will give us, a more comprehensive view of the topic. So the research problem is just that. It's an issue or something missing, something that is unresolved or missing in the research that your study is designed to address, right? It's designed to, your study is designed to get information that's going to help fill that gap or help shed some light on that issue. So just let's say your research problem is a gap. Right, a gap in the knowledge. We lack information on this topic or in this area. How do you write about a research problem that's a gap? How do you write about a gap? In other words, a gap by definition is an absence, right? A gap is like a hole, right? There's nothing there. So how do you write about something that doesn't exist? And this is what, somebody gave me this analogy, and I think it's an apt analogy, and it's helped me to understand the research problem if it's a gap. Think about a donut, right? Donut has a hole in the middle. Okay, the hole, you can't describe the hole because it's an absence of something, right? But what you can do is describe the donut, right, around it. So the donut then corresponds, the hole in the donut corresponds to the gap in the research. The donut itself corresponds to the research that is existing on the topic that, isn't on your topic because that's the gap, but it's all the research that surrounds it, right? So, and by highlighting what is in the research, you then can highlight what is absent in the research, and then, show your reader that there is a gap. In other words, you can't just say there's a gap. You can't just say, well, there's a gap in this, we need research on it. Well, okay, well, you need to show the research that's been done near it to help highlight that there is a gap. Okay, I hope that makes, I'm explaining that well. Again, about 2 solid paragraphs for that. And again, with the caveat of always, sticking to your school's template. The purpose statement is very specifically worded, usually. And I have examples here, a quantitative example, a qualitative example, and I have the template kind of language, right? I mean, this is pretty standard. The purpose statement itself should read, the purpose of this approach, design, study, is to examine or explore, we'll get to that in a minute, the variables or concepts in sample setting. So let's just take it with a quantitative example. The purpose of this quantitative, that's your approach, correlational, that would be your design, study, is to examine, investigate, usually works better for quantitative studies. Something like explore usually works better for qualitative studies, where you're exploring something that you don't have all the information yet. So the purpose of this quantitative correlational study is to examine the relationship between transformational leadership, here's your variables, and emotional intelligence, and then whatever population, sample and setting, in healthcare workers, and whatever setting it is. So that's the template, and you should stick pretty closely to that. Obviously, your purpose statement is going to have its own details, and I have a qualitative example too. That's the purpose statement itself. The purpose section is a little longer than that. Again, it's not that long. It's probably a solid paragraph. The purpose section may include specific information about the variables or the concepts or the instruments that you're going to use to measure those. Another thing to say about the purpose statement, the purpose of the study is statement. Anytime you mention your purpose within your study anywhere else, your purpose statement needs to stay the same. And that's the same with your research questions too. And that's the only time you get a pass. Professors do not like when you copy and paste material from one section of your dissertation to another section. Like you're not really plagiarizing yourself, but they see it as being intellectually lazy. You just can't copy and paste material. But however, the purpose and the research questions, you can. The purpose never changes. It always, don't think it's one of these things where it's like, I got to change it up, because no, the purpose is like, it's the nutshell version of what you're doing in your study. Okay, it tells you, what you're doing, what you're going to examine, what you're looking at, and in your sample setting. So that doesn't change. Same thing with your research questions. If you need to just mention them again later in the study, they stay the same. Okay, the research questions themselves. This is not a methodological focused webinar, so I'm not going to go into developing research questions, but we do have webinars on research questions specifically and methods specifically. So if you're interested in kind of developing research questions, I suggest you look at what we offer for the webinars for that, for the methods. But they usually come here after the purpose. And the theoretical framework usually comes next. The big question, which is, I have the second point here, is a conceptual framework or theoretical framework. Usually on a practical level, theoretical frameworks are typically associated with quantitative studies. Conceptual frameworks are typically associated with qualitative studies. And the theoretical framework, what it is it's a theory or concepts or a couple of theories put together if you need to, that will help guide your study and help explain the results at the end in the discussion chapter. So how do you handle this section? This is a really good section to look at, like I mentioned earlier, that example that you had that you're going to get when you sit down to draft. This is a really good, because people tend to struggle with this because they're not really sure what it is, what to do with it. Check out that, the example if you have one or two. This is a good section for that. But what you want to do is basically, start with a pretty simple declarative sentence. I don't mean simple, I mean straightforward. So-and-so theory, or whatever it is, framework will serve as the theoretical foundation or the theoretical framework or the conceptual framework for the present study. And when you name the theory you're going to use, have a source for it, right? And usually associated with the major theorist who helped develop the theory. What you then want to do is define the theory, right? Including any components. Theories sometimes have components to them, and they may be things that you're measuring. You want to define the components. You want to, mention who developed it, right? And again, have sources for this. What did they develop it for? Theories explain things. So what did the person develop the theory to explain? We'll discuss a little bit what researchers have used the theory for. And then, the important part is, how does this connect to your study? How is it going to help guide your study? How does it relate to what you're doing? I think part of the problem, the challenge people have with the framework is they overthink it, or they're not sure about it. If you're doing a quantitative study, the theoretical framework should be pretty straightforward. Okay. People, you have research questions, you have something you're going to do, you have a focus, and then they start casting around for theories. Well, I got to find a theory. What I'm going to, maybe this one. It doesn't work like that. If you're doing a quantitative study, the theory should fundamentally be based on the instruments that you're using. So if you're doing a study on emotional intelligence, you're going to measure emotional intelligence. There are surveys and instruments for emotional intelligence. Whatever one you're going to be using, all these surveys have theoretical foundations. They don't have theoretical bases, because they don't come out of nothing, right? The theorists don't develop these the questions from nothing. They develop them from theoretical foundations. So your instrument is going to have a theoretical basis, a theoretical foundation. So you want to go to that theoretical foundation and use that as part of your as your theoretical framework. Just a minute, I'll be right back. Okay, pardon me. Okay, so these your instruments have theoretical foundations that can serve as your theoretical framework for your study. So let's go back to the emotional intelligence instrument. There's several, right? So if you're using Goleman, he's a big emotional intelligence theorist. If you're using Goleman's instrument, use Goleman's theory of emotional intelligence as your theoretical framework. Don't use Smith's theory of emotional intelligence, because they may be a little different. They may measure different things. They may have different components. Like I said, there's going to be several instruments. Choose the instrument that's most suited for what you're going to do, but then use the theory from that theorist who developed that instrument as part of your theoretical framework, or as your theoretical framework. Now, if you're measuring two different things, emotional intelligence and, say, transformational leadership, right? The theory of transformational leadership will be the other part of your theoretical framework. And again, whatever instrument you're using, that should align with the theorist you're using. So the theoretical framework for quantitative studies, there shouldn't be like a lot of guesswork, like what theory should I use? These theories should come from the constructs and the instruments that you're measuring. For qualitative studies, it's a little different. There's a conceptual framework. Sometimes there may not be theories, because qualitative research tends to be exploratory. There may not be theories that cover what you're doing. So usually going with the major concepts that you're looking at, going to the literature and seeing some of the major theorists about the concepts that you're going to use, bringing those in to help put a framework together. And in qualitative studies, the framework is important too, because it helps guide your interview questions, right? So your interview questions don't just come from nowhere. They or what you think is important, which can be important. They come from the literature, which will help, which comes from your framework, right? So the major concepts that you want to get at and look at in your qualitative study, those things should come from the peer-reviewed literature that you want to look at. And again, will help guide things, including the interview questions. Okay, nature of the study or study design. Again, sometimes there's a bit of methodology in the chapter 1. And again, this is not a methodological seminar, or sorry, webinar. So if you are interested in more of this, like, look at what we offer as far as methodology seminars. But basically, it's going to include a rationale for the selection of your design. Why did you choose a correlational design? That kind of thing. You want to summarize the methodology, including from whom and how the data is going to be collected and how the data will be analyzed. And again, yes, study design is covered in depth in methodology webinars. Okay, definitions. Usually there's a definition section in the chapter 1, and this is, to define the terms and the variables that are specific to your study. So any variables, if it's quantitative, any factors or any variables, things that you're studying definitely belong here. Any major concepts belong here too. Sometimes people want to define their methods terms. You don't need to define your methods terms here. You're going to talk a lot about methods in chapter 3. I always, again, follow your school's template. I always just advise to put definitions in the form of sentences instead of fragments. It's just easier because sometimes professors will come back and say, I want this in the form of a sentence. So I just say, write them in the form of a sentence to begin with. They should be clear and succinct. Okay, so these are definitions of specific terms and specific factors that you're going to be using in your study as you're going to be using them, as you're going to be defining them. So usually a sentence, maybe 2. These aren't long, they're not discussions. Sometimes I see folks, right, well, so-and-so defines emotional intelligence this way. However, somebody else defines it this way. I want to make it clear that, okay, again, the definitions are not discussions, right? It's just a clear statement of how the term will be defined for your study. Again, a sentence, maybe 2. And it's just it's adequate, it's efficient just to stick with pretty straightforward language. Emotional intelligence for the purposes of this study will be defined as, or emotional intelligence refers to, just simple declarative sentences like that. They should be supported with peer-reviewed sources. Absolutely no dictionary definitions, because these are not general definitions, right? They are definitions specific to your study, and they should be specific to the research literature. Sources should be recent when possible. Yeah, it's for the definitions, it's not always that important. But when they can be recent, it's always best. But sometimes some definitions will come from the theories or something, and theories are usually a little older. So that one's not as important, but definitely the peer-reviewed sources part is important. Oh, and they should be sequenced alphabetically. Oh, and just real quick, all you need to introduce this section, sometimes you don't even need an introduction. If you do, it's usually one sentence. The following terms are defined for use in the study, period. And then just go into the definitions. Significance, sometimes this is called implications. Significance, it's what professors like to call the so what section. So you're doing the study. So meaning, who's going to care, who's going to be impacted by the information that you get or the data that you collect, who's it going to matter to, and why. So again, they want you to talk a little bit about in this section the significance this is going to have. And usually this is two-pronged. Number one, research / theoretical significance, and number two, practical significance. So the one prong is how can what you're doing and the information you collect, how can it add to the literature? How can it contribute to the research? What is it going to tell us that we don't already know? And again, you're not going to know exactly, but it wants you to forecast, right? To make a case for, this is important information. We need it because of, what it's going to tell us. It's going to shed light on something in the research that we didn't know before. It's going to add, extra depth or understanding. There may be theoretical implications, if this theory is appropriate to, study this population. And, the other part is how it can inform practice, right? So why and to whom might the information be important? How might your findings inform what people do in your area at the level of practice? So let's say you're doing an education study. Your findings may have significance or implications for teachers, for what teachers actually do, what they do in the classroom. It could have significance for administrators. It could tell them certain things, what classes to offer, what not to offer, who to hire. And so that's the kind of thing they're looking for, practical level significance. Okay. Other section, I've kind of squished these together because these are some sections at schools. There's some discrepancy about some schools have them, some schools don't, some schools have some of them. So again, just, I know you're tired of hearing me say it, just check with your school specific template. Usually they want some discussions of potential limitations. Obviously, again, you're forecasting, you don't know what is going to actually be a limitation. But they want you to discuss what you can foresee as maybe being weaknesses or shortcomings that may actually affect your results, right? So we're still dealing with COVID to some degree. So, that can always, potentially throw a wrench into your gears as far as maybe, maybe face-to-face interviews are out, but you can do Zoom interviews. So that's not a big deal. But maybe getting the population that you want may be a little difficult. Getting access to something may be a little difficult. For quantitative studies, getting a sample size, sure you can get the sample size adequate for what you need. And again, sometimes access to certain populations is a little difficult. Assumptions. The bigger, these are things that you can't control, right? So you have to, for the study to move forward, you just have to assume certain things. And the big one is, one of the big ones is you have to assume that your participants are going to be honest and they're going to answer to the best of their ability, because you can't control what they say. You can't control them, which is as it should be. But so you just have to assume that what you're going to get is honest responses. Scope and delimitations. Sometimes it's interchangeable. Sometimes it's scope and delimitations. But scope is really, it's kind of the boundaries of your study, right? If limitations are things that you can't really control, delimitations would be like the things you put on your study to create, a boundary. So you're looking at everything within this scope, but not the things outside of it. And it sounds a lot, usually the language sounds a lot like your purpose. Here's what I'm going to focus on. Here's why. Here's the people it involves. Here's the setting. And sometimes that's helpful, and if you're doing an education study and you're just going to focus on just students, you're not going to focus on teachers, you're not going to focus on administrators, not parents, just teachers. So it helps kind of define the boundaries. And these sections typically are not that long, and they're also helpful to look at examples for these. And here we are at the summary. Like in any summary, recap major points of the chapter. And recapping points of the chapter means recapping points of the chapter. It doesn't mean saying, well, I had an introduction section, I had a research problem section, I had the research questions. I mean, that's just a list of your headers. Just, recap major points of the chapter. Remind the reader of the research problem and why your study is needed. And again, check your school's template, but you can end by transitioning to the next chapter. The next chapter will be the literature review chapter 2. And that's it. Let's see. Yeah, and so by the, when you're done with your chapter 1, I mean, when your reader is, like, ideally, they should know, again, they should know the blueprint of your study, what you're going to study, why you're going to study it. You've made an argument for that, why it's needed, and how you're going to do it. Okay, and length of chapter 1, I would say anywhere between 10 to 20 pages, with the sweet spot being, 10 to 15. If quantitative study, the chapter tends to be maybe a little lighter, or not lighter, but not as many pages, 8 to 10 pages. Qualitative could be, 10 to 15, but ballpark 10 to 20. Okay. Here, this is the information about who we are. Dissertation, consulting, editing, statistics support, guidance, and our contact information. So I know I have a couple questions here waiting, which I'm going to get to. And then if you have other questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box or the question and answer box. Let's see. So first question is, can you use older research and recent research to show that the problem has been around for a while and should be fixed, and note the gaps? Yes, you can. Yeah. And in fact, in the background would be the perfect place to put in the older research. And even in the research problem, you can note the older research, like especially if it's foundational, but the focus once you get to the research problem should really be on what's going on now, should be on the more recent research. But again, if you need to use some of the older research to help set that up, that's fine. In this section, focus a little more on the recent research, and the background is a perfect place for the older research. Like, can the introduction, let's see, next question. Can the introduction and background sections be combined under the heading of context of the study? Sure. I mean, yeah, I've seen that before. And again, that is really up to your school, what your template says. If you don't have a template, I would see what your chair recommends. Sometimes chairs have, things they like to see. I think that'll work. That could work. As long as in the context of your study, it's clear where you're beginning to talk about, the current research problem and what you're going to do, what the research problem is. I think if things are clear to the reader, I think that's fine. Okay, let's see. In what chapter should I include the context of a research partnership, e.g. between a university and a non-dominant community? The collaboration started in year involved blank, and some examples of the results, more details in chapter 1. Yeah, I'm not. If it involves your method, is this what? If it involves part of your method, then it should probably be mentioned in your in your methods in your chapter 1. But yeah, I think if you have something like that, that's a little different and that involves that, yeah, it should definitely be at least mentioned in chapter 1, and probably discussed a little bit in chapter 1. So, I mean, in other words, and even if you discuss it later in another chapter, you don't want it to come as a surprise, right? Like in the method, like chapter 3 or something. Oh, this research partnership. So yeah, there should be some setup of it in chapter 1, definitely. Okay. Good morning. My study is looking at leadership impact on claim handlers' performance. On the framework, should I outline the MLQ and also the job performance also? Yes, if you're using the MLQ, right, the theoretical foundation of, you know, what goes into the MLQ, which I think it's transactional, transformational, laissez-faire. Yes, those components should be in there, should be defined. And job performance, right? So if you're using a job performance questionnaire, which it sounds like you are, yes, job performance would be the other part of your framework, and you would use the theoretical foundations of whoever's instrument you're using for job performance, because they'll probably have their own specific kind of definition, which may be similar to other ones, but you always want it to align with whatever instrument you're using. So in other words, if you're using Smith's instrument, don't use Jones's definition, if that makes sense. Okay. Yep. Would it be combined into one framework? Yes, it would be. Yep. You would need, right, those two theories would constitute your framework, would be, so you'd have one framework, you just have two parts to it. That's a good question and a good example. Any other questions? Okay, well, great. Well, sounds like everybody's good on chapter 1 then. Remember, we do offer run other webinars on other chapters, 2, 3, 4, 5, and other components, specifically like, methods, specific methods components. So check our calendar to see what we're running when, and, tune in if you'd like. And, if you want to talk to somebody just about what we do, obviously there's no obligation, just to get some information to see if what we offer is right for you. Reach out to us at any of the contact information that we have, which is, oops, sorry, which is right there. Great, you're welcome. You're welcome, everybody. Have a great rest of your day, and good luck. And again, use your resources. And a lot of this game is just perseverance. Do you have resources on academic writing? There's a ton of resources out there. There was a writing guide that I used to like. The person's name is Joseph Williams, and it's more of a style guide, a template. We have templates on our website. We have templates for all the chapters on the website. Yep. We do have, yes. Yep. Thank you, Brittany. Yep. And we have templates there. You're welcome to peruse and pull what you need. But again, just see if your school has their own specific template, which may differ slightly. Okay. Great. Thank you, Brittany. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day and good luck. All right. Bye-bye.